February 1944, Auschwitz-Birkenau, section BIIE. The air was sharp, filled with a bitter mixture of frost and ash. It was not the cold alone that made the young girl's hands tremble, but the knowledge that she was holding something forbidden. Beneath her coarse grey coat, pressed close against her ribs, was a single worn book. The spine was cracked, the cover stained with age and smoke, yet she guarded it as if it were her own heartbeat. The camp loudspeakers had not yet crackled to life, but already the prisoners were stirring, their shapes moving like shadows between the rows of wooden barracks. Smoke drifted from the chimneys, curling low across the snow, settling like dust on faces that no longer looked surprised by morning. Somewhere beyond the wire, dogs barked. She was 16 years old. Her name was Dita, and inside the pocket of her coat was one of the last books left in Auschwitz. Before the sun rose, she checked the seams of her clothing again. The book was wrapped in a torn scrap of cloth, the edges softened by her touch. Each morning she woke, wondering if this would be the day they found it. Possessing a book in this place was an act that could end her life, but she kept it anyway. She could not explain why. Maybe it was because of her father's words years ago in Prague, when he locked his bookshop for the last time. Books, he had told her, are the only things that can take you away, even when your body cannot move. She had carried that sentence through the train cars, through the smoke, through the gate crowned with iron letters. Now, standing in the grey half-light, she looked toward the guard tower and whispered to herself, "They can take everything but not this." She was not speaking of the book alone. She pressed it closer to her chest as the morning whistle blew. Around her, hundreds of prisoners stepped into lines. The world seemed reduced to rhythm, the crunch of boots, the clatter of metal bowls, the dull voice of command. Yet inside her coat, there was a heartbeat that did not belong to the camp's machinery. Before we move deeper into her story, imagine this for a moment. Imagine being 16, holding something small but precious, knowing that discovery means death. Would you have done the same? If you would have tried to save even one page, tell me below what you would have protected and why. The guards began counting. The lines moved toward the work details. Dita adjusted her scarf, lowering her eyes. The book's weight was almost nothing, yet it felt as if it anchored her to something real. In a world built to erase identity, she had found a reason to remember who she was. That morning, she did not know that the small object under her coat would make her part of something larger, the secret library of Auschwitz, a place that was never meant to exist. She did not yet know that within a few weeks she would be called the librarian. But on that February dawn, all she wanted was to keep the book hidden one more day. And so began the quietest rebellion in the history of the camp. The memory of Prague did not come to Dita as a single image, but as a series of sensations light on glass. The rustle of pages, the smell of paper and ink that filled her father's bookshop. Before the war, before the yellow stars and deportation lists, that small shop on Vinohrady Street had been her world. Her father used to lift her onto a stool so she could reach the higher shelves, and she would spend whole afternoons tracing her fingers over the embossed titles. Her mother would tease her, saying, "One day you will vanish into a book and forget to come out." Dita would laugh, not knowing that such an escape might one day be her only hope. She remembered that winter of 1939 when everything began to darken. Posters appeared on street corners, shop signs changed names, and customers stopped coming. Friends who once waved from across the street suddenly crossed to the other side. Her father kept the shop open as long as he could, though each week there were fewer books on the shelves. Some were confiscated, others sold quietly to pay rent. The day he was ordered to hang a sign reading "Jewish Business," he stood in the doorway for a long time before hammering it in. Dita had watched him from the upstairs window. She never forgot the sound, 3 slow strikes of the hammer echoing through the street. At night, when the curfew began, her father would sit by the window reading aloud from whatever book remained. His voice, calm and steady, filled the small apartment. "Remember, Dita," he would say, "as long as we can read, they cannot tell us what to think." Then came the morning when soldiers appeared in the shop. They moved through the aisles like cold wind, pointing, shouting, marking boxes with chalk. Her father was forced to sign papers he did not understand. When they left, he stood among the half-empty shelves and whispered, "They have taken the books, but not their words." That night, he packed a small suitcase. Inside, he placed one photograph, a pair of glasses, and a slim book of geography that had belonged to Dita. "Keep this," he said. "It will remind you that the world is larger than what you see." She did not know then that the world was about to become smaller than she could imagine. In the months that followed, restrictions multiplied. They could not ride trams, could not visit parks, could not attend school. Her friends disappeared one by one, and in the summer of 1942, their names appeared on a transport list. Her mother sewed identification tags into their coats. The family was allowed to take only 20 kilograms each. Dita packed clothes, a hairbrush, and the geography book. At the train station, she saw other families clutching similar bundles. Some cried, others were silent. Soldiers shouted numbers. Steam rose from the engine, wrapping everything in white haze. Her father bent close and whispered, "Remember what I told you. Keep something inside you that no one can take." Then the whistle blew. The journey was endless. Days merged into nights. Through the slats of the wooden wagon, she saw fields sliding past, then forests, then only darkness. Someone said they were going east. No one knew where. When the train stopped at Terezin, the air smelled of damp straw and smoke. The camp was supposed to be a model settlement. There were concerts and plays, but everyone understood that it was a disguise. People arrived and vanished again. The geography book went with Dita everywhere, hidden under her thin blanket. Months later, a rumor spread. A new transport, farther east. Her mother tried to believe it meant work, but her father's eyes said otherwise. On a grey morning, they were herded once more onto a train. The book was still with her, its pages creased and frayed. It would be the last memory of Prague. She carried the echo of her father's voice, the scent of paper and dust, and the idea that somewhere beyond the barbed wire, the world was still wide and waiting. The train came to a stop with a shudder that jolted everyone awake. The sound of metal grinding against metal echoed through the wagons, followed by shouts in a language Dita barely understood. The doors were thrown open. A blast of cold air rushed in, thick with the smell of smoke and something she could not name. It was night, but the sky glowed faintly orange, lit by fires burning somewhere beyond the tracks. Guards shouted orders. Dogs barked. People stumbled from the train, clutching bundles that had already begun to fall apart. The ground was uneven, covered in cinders and mud. Above them, in the distance, Dita saw a sign made of iron letters. She did not yet know what it said, only that the air around it felt like the end of the world. Her mother gripped her arm. "Do not let go," she whispered. Her father was ahead of them, trying to keep the family together as they were pushed toward the line of lights. They moved past men in uniforms who pointed them into two columns, one to the right, one to the left. Some families were separated instantly. Dita saw a woman pulled away from her son. She heard a man shouting names, the sound lost in the chaos. A guard waved them forward. The line shuffled through a gate, and the iron letters came into view. Arbeit macht frei. Dita sounded the words out under her breath without knowing their meaning. Inside the compound, the light was dim, filtered through smoke. They were ordered to leave their suitcases. Soldiers moved among the piles, throwing belongings into carts. The geography book slipped from her grasp, fell into the mud, and was gone before she could reach for it. That was the moment she realized that nothing they had brought with them would remain. They were taken into a building where the heat was suffocating. Steam rose from pipes. Voices echoed. The guards shouted again, clothes off, shoes here, hair there. Dita tried to hold her mother's hand, but the crowd pressed between them. When she stepped out again, she was wearing a coarse grey dress and wooden clogs. Her head felt lighter, her reflection in the metal door unrecognizable. Numbers were called. A woman with a tattooing needle took her arm. The sting was brief but unforgettable. A series of digits appeared on her skin, blue and raw. No name, only a number. She wanted to cry, but the tears would not come. They were marched toward a row of wooden barracks surrounded by fences. Inside, straw pallets were stacked in tiers, and the air smelled of mold and sweat. Someone told them this was the family camp. There were children here, even a small schoolroom. Dita could not understand why such a place would exist in the middle of this nightmare. Later she would learn that the family camp was a deception. It was meant to show visitors that conditions were humane, that the prisoners were treated well. The truth lay in the distance, behind the smoke and the silence. That first night, lying on the rough boards, Dita could not sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the geography book sinking into the mud. In the morning she woke with its weight still in her hands, only to remember it was gone. Her father was assigned to a labor detail. Her mother was given kitchen duty. Dita was told she would help with the children. She looked at her tattooed number, tracing it with her fingertip until it began to fade beneath the dirt. She thought of Prague, of the bookshop, of the maps she used to draw. And she wondered how far she had traveled from home, not in miles, but in meaning. The camp bell rang. Another day began. She did not know it yet, but the place she had been sent to, the place of smoke, fences and fear, would soon become the setting of a quiet miracle. Morning light seeped through the cracks of the wooden walls, soft and grey. The camp was already awake. Steam rose from the wash troughs where prisoners hurried through the motions of cleanliness with frozen fingers. In the distance, the roll call square echoed with barking orders. Dita stood at the edge of the barrack, clutching a tin bowl, when a man approached, tall, lean, wearing the same striped uniform but moving with a kind of quiet purpose. His voice, when he spoke, was calm and direct. "You are from the new transport?" She nodded. "Good. You will come with me. We need someone to help with the children." His name was Freddie Hirsch. His presence was unlike anything in that place. The guards shouted. He never raised his voice. The others bowed their heads. He looked people in the eye. Dita followed him through the compound to Barrack 31, the so-called education block. From the outside, it was like every other building, long, low, and made of unpainted planks. But when the door opened, she froze. Inside were children, perhaps 100 of them, seated on rough benches. Some were singing softly, others were drawing on scraps of paper with bits of charcoal. A few teachers moved among them, speaking in whispers. "This," Hirsch said, "is our school." She looked around in disbelief. "A school? Here?" He smiled faintly. "It is what we tell them. They want the camp to look civilized, so they allow this so long as it amuses them." His tone darkened. "But while it lasts, we will make it real." He led her to a small table in the corner, stacked with worn notebooks, bits of chalk, and 2 books so damaged their titles were barely legible. "You will help the teachers keep order," he said. "And when you can, read to the younger ones. It keeps them quiet. It keeps them human." That first day, she sat among the children, watching their faces as a young man recited geography lessons from memory. The word itself struck her like a bell. Geography, the subject of her father's book. She closed her eyes and saw the maps again, the lines of rivers and mountains, the places that still existed beyond the wire. When the session ended, Hirsch gathered the teachers. "Tomorrow we begin a new routine," he said. "The inspectors may come at any time. We must look orderly, cheerful, but behind that, we will teach what matters." He turned to Dita. "You seem careful," he said. "We need careful people. There are a few books here, real ones. They must not be seen by anyone outside this room. Can you keep a secret?" She hesitated only a moment before answering. "Yes." That night, as she returned to her bunk, she felt something she had not felt since leaving Prague, a faint sense of direction. Not hope exactly, but a path. She looked at the sky through the narrow window and imagined the stars as letters scattered across a dark page. The next morning she would learn the truth of the library. But for now it was enough to know that somewhere inside this place of silence and smoke, words were still alive. The following morning, frost clung to the edges of the barrack windows. A pale light spread across the camp, revealing shapes of men and women already standing in line for roll call. Inside Barrack 31, the children gathered again, their voices low, their eyes cautious. Dita moved quietly among them, straightening benches, collecting scraps of paper, pretending not to notice when a guard's shadow passed by the small window. When the door closed and the footsteps faded, Freddie Hirsch motioned for her to follow. He led her to a narrow space behind the classroom wall, where the wood planks had warped just enough to create a shallow gap. From beneath a blanket, he lifted a bundle wrapped in grey cloth. Inside were books, 8 of them. Dita gasped. The smell of paper and dust rose like perfume. Some were worn beyond recognition, pages missing, covers faded. Yet to her they were treasures. Hirsch unwrapped each one carefully. A Russian grammar, a French novel, a geometry textbook, a history of the world, a manual on hygiene, a book of legends, a dictionary, and a single small volume of the Old Testament. "They come from different places," Hirsch said. "Some smuggled from the Czech transport, others taken from luggage. We keep them hidden. Each teacher borrows one, teaches from it, then returns it here. No one must know." Dita reached out to touch the nearest book. The pages were thin, fragile as wings. She turned one carefully and saw words underlined in pencil. Someone before her had studied here, perhaps in a classroom far from this place, never imagining where the book would end. Hirsch watched her. "You are young," he said softly, "but you are careful, and you can read Czech, German, and a little French. I want you to guard them." She looked up, startled. "Me?" "Yes. We cannot risk keeping them together. You will take 2 at a time, hide them during the day, and return them after roll call. If they are found here, we all die. If they are found on you, only you die." He said it without cruelty, only with the blunt honesty of the camp. Dita felt her pulse quicken. The idea was terrifying, but also intoxicating. She thought of her father, of the geography book buried in the mud outside the gate. Perhaps this was her way of replacing what was lost. She nodded. "I will do it." That night, she wrapped the first 2 books, a dictionary and the Book of Legends, in a piece of cloth torn from her skirt. She slid them inside the lining of her coat, near the hem, stitching the edges by candlelight. Each stitch felt like a heartbeat. The next day, when she walked through the camp, she felt their weight pressing gently against her legs. She was no longer only a number on a uniform. She was the guardian of words. During lessons, she watched the teachers use the books with reverence. They never read directly for fear of discovery. Instead, they memorized passages and recited them as if speaking from memory. The children listened, unaware of the danger surrounding every sentence. In the evenings, Dita unstitched the hem, checked that the pages were intact, then rewrapped them for the night. She learned to move calmly when guards entered, to breathe evenly even as her heart raced. Once, during inspection, a soldier walked so close she could smell the tobacco on his gloves. His hand brushed the edge of her coat. For a moment she thought she would faint. Then he moved on. When the door closed, Hirsch caught her eye and gave the slightest nod. She exhaled slowly, realizing that she had just survived her first test as a librarian. Outside, snow began to fall, silent and endless. Inside, in the faint glow of a candle, Dita placed her hand on the Book of Legends and whispered a promise to it. "I will keep you safe." She did not think of herself as brave, only necessary. And for that night, in a world built on lies, she held the truth between her hands. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that only those inside the camp could understand, a rhythm built not on freedom, but on survival. Morning roll call, work assignments, brief rations of bread, endless counting. Yet within the wooden walls of Barrack 31, another pattern had begun to take shape. Beneath the noise of boots and orders, there was the quiet pulse of something fragile and sacred, the act of learning. Dita carried her books each morning as though they were invisible children clinging to her legs. She had learned the small art of deception, how to walk naturally, how to hide fear behind stillness. She had memorized the guards' routines, the moments when attention drifted. Every heartbeat was measured, every gesture deliberate. Inside the education block, the children gathered as always. The teachers took turns leading lessons, reciting from memory, letting a page rest open for only a few seconds at a time before closing it again. The books never left Dita's side unless absolutely necessary. She became their keeper, their silent witness. There were teachers from Prague, Warsaw, Vienna, men and women who had once taught in real schools, now reduced to whispers. They had devised a code. If someone said, "The weather will change today," it meant a guard was approaching. The books vanished under blankets or inside hollowed wooden blocks before the door opened. When the danger passed, the lessons resumed as if nothing had happened. One afternoon, Dita watched a teacher named Miriam read from the Book of Legends to a group of children sitting cross-legged on the floor. Her voice trembled slightly at first, then steadied. "There was once a man who carried light inside him," she said. "Even when he was trapped underground, the light stayed." The children listened in perfect silence. Dita felt the meaning ripple through the room, something unspoken passing between them, a reminder that stories were not just words but shelter. Later that evening, after the final count, Hirsch gathered the adults in a corner. "The inspectors may come next week," he warned. "They want to see our so-called model camp. If they enter this block, everything must look like a simple nursery. If they find the books..." He let the sentence die in the air. The teachers nodded. They understood. When the meeting ended, Dita returned to her bunk and took out the dictionary. Its pages were so thin that her breath moved them. She ran her finger along the printed lines, tracing the letters as if relearning how to read. The act itself felt defiant. She whispered the words under her breath, not their meanings, only their shape, so quietly that even the night could not overhear her. Each word was a step back toward humanity, each page a heartbeat that refused to stop. Sometimes, during the late hours, she heard the sounds of the camp, the barking dogs, the metallic clank of doors, the cry of someone being called outside. But inside the barrack there was another sound, the soft rhythm of pages turning, of pencils scratching faintly against paper, of children repeating lines they had memorized. That was the music of their resistance. The silence they kept was not emptiness, it was protection, an invisible wall between the children and the horror beyond the wire. They were guarding more than just books. They were guarding the idea that knowledge could still exist in a world built on ignorance. Freddie Hirsch once told her, "The loudest courage is often quiet." And so they worked in whispers, building an invisible fortress out of stories. When Dita lay down that night, Exhaustion pressed against her like a second skin, yet she felt something steady within her, a quiet strength that had nothing to do with muscles or power. It came from the pages she carried, from the teachers who refused to stop teaching, from the children who still believed in tomorrow. Outside, the guards shouted once more before the floodlights dimmed. Inside, a girl closed her eyes and dreamed of paper wings. The day began with a stillness that felt unnatural, as if the entire camp were holding its breath. The sky was colorless, the light flat and cold. Even the guards seemed more alert than usual. Dita sensed it the moment she stepped outside. Something was different. Freddie Hirsch confirmed it in a whisper. "They are coming today," he said. The inspectors. A rumor had already spread through the family camp that morning. A delegation from Berlin, accompanied by photographers, would arrive to see the so-called model settlement. For days, the prisoners had been forced to clean, paint signs, arrange flowers that would die within hours. The deception had to look perfect. Inside Barrack 31, the teachers worked with a precision that bordered on choreography. Toys made from scraps were placed neatly on tables. The older children practiced songs in low voices. Dita moved through the room, her heartbeat sharp and fast. Beneath her skirt, 2 books were hidden, the dictionary and the Book of Legends. Hirsch gathered them quickly. "Remember," he said, "smile when they speak to you. Keep your eyes down. If they ask what you are teaching, say it is arithmetic and songs, nothing more." Outside, a car engine roared. Then came the sound of boots, many boots on frozen earth. The door swung open. A group of men entered, wearing heavy coats and leather gloves. One of them carried a camera, another a notebook. Their uniforms gleamed. Behind them stood an officer whose expression was both curious and bored, as if the suffering around him were merely a form of paperwork. He looked over the room and said, "Ah, the children's block. Excellent. So clean." Hirsch stepped forward, his face calm. "Yes, Herr Officer. The children learn songs and drawing. It keeps them occupied." The officer nodded, his gaze sweeping the room. He paused at the group of children seated on benches, then at the table where Dita stood. She felt the weight of his eyes, the sudden heat in her chest. He walked toward her, his boots leaving prints in the dust. "And you, Mädchen," he said, "what is your duty here?" Her throat tightened, but her voice came out steady. "I help keep order, sir. I clean the benches and fetch water." He studied her for a moment longer, then reached out and brushed the fabric of her skirt with his gloved hand. "So young," he said, almost to himself. Then he turned away. The visit lasted less than 15 minutes. Photographs were taken, smiling children, neat rows, tidy walls. The delegation left as suddenly as it had arrived. When the door closed, the barrack remained silent for a long moment. Then the teachers exhaled as one. Hirsch sank onto a bench, his hands shaking for the first time. "We did it," he whispered. Dita stood still, feeling the sweat cool on her skin. Her legs trembled under the weight of the hidden books. Slowly she sank down, pulling them free and setting them on the table. The teachers gathered around, staring at the small volumes as if seeing them for the first time. The dictionary was still intact. The Book of Legends had a crease across its cover where her hand had pressed too tightly. Hirsch looked at her and said softly, "You understand now why we call them sacred?" She nodded. "Yes, because they lived." He smiled, weary but proud. "And because you made them live." That night, when darkness returned, Dita lay awake listening to the faint hum of the power lines above the camp. For the first time, she felt not only fear, but purpose. The inspection had proved what she had begun to suspect, that even in a place built on death, something could survive not by strength, but by care, by silence, by will. The next morning, life in the camp resumed its rhythm of labor and hunger, but something had shifted. In the eyes of the teachers, in the way the children whispered their lessons, there was a quiet reverence for the small girl who had carried books beneath her skirt while the enemy smiled for photographs. From that day on, Dita was no longer simply a helper. She was, in truth and in spirit, the librarian. In the days after the inspection, the camp seemed to exhale. The guards grew less watchful, the tension loosened slightly, and the sky took on the pale color of early spring. Snow melted into mud that clung to boots and hems, and the air smelled faintly of thawing earth. For most, it meant nothing. But for Dita, it felt like the world itself was remembering how to breathe. Her duties in Barrack 31 had become routine, though nothing about them was ordinary. Each morning, she arrived before the children, checked the hiding places behind the wall, and distributed the books one by one to the teachers. They handled them as if touching something sacred, After lessons, she collected the volumes again, wiping dust from the covers, counting the pages as carefully as a banker counting coins. The children called her Miss Dita. It was a name spoken in whispers, but it carried a kind of warmth that made her smile despite herself. She taught them letters using pieces of charcoal on scraps of burlap. When she ran out of space, she used the wall. The lessons were simple: A for apple, B for bird, but each letter felt like defiance. To teach a child to spell in a place designed to erase language was an act of rebellion. Sometimes, when the lessons ended, she gathered the younger ones and read to them from memory. The Book of Legends was too dangerous to open often, so she learned its stories by heart. A fisherman who could speak to stars, a girl who found courage in the dark, a man who remembered his name even when everyone else forgot it. The children listened with eyes wide and mouths slightly open. For those few minutes, the camp faded away. The fences vanished, the towers dissolved, and they were somewhere else entirely inside a world built of words. One afternoon, Hirsch found her sitting on the floor with a group of children around her. They were copying letters into the dirt, their fingers tracing uneven lines. He stood watching for a moment before saying quietly, "You are building something they cannot destroy." She looked up, unsure what to say. He smiled. "When the war ends, and it will end, someone will remember that this happened, that you kept learning alive." His words stayed with her. That night after roll call, she tore a corner from a piece of paper and began writing. The pencil was short, barely longer than her thumb. She wrote names, children's names, teachers' names, the titles of books, the dates of lessons. She hid the paper inside the hollow leg of a stool. It was not much, but it was a record, a testimony. Weeks passed. The weather warmed. The children grew thinner, yet they still came to lessons, their energy drawn from somewhere deeper than food. Dita taught them to write their initials on bits of cloth, then collected the scraps and stored them with the books. "So you will not be forgotten," she said. One day a little boy asked her, "Miss Dita, why do we have to learn if we might not get out?" She looked at him for a long moment before answering, "Because learning means we are still alive today, and that is enough." The boy nodded, satisfied. He did not need more explanation. As the days lengthened, the barrack became quieter. Rumors drifted in like smoke transports to the east, names called at random, new arrivals who did not stay long. But inside the education block, time seemed to move differently. Each lesson was an island of order in a sea of chaos. Dita noticed that the teachers no longer smiled much. Hirsch's face was thinner, the shadows under his eyes darker. Yet every morning, he was there, straightening benches, adjusting the curtain, making sure the illusion of a classroom remained intact. For the children, it was still a school. For Dita, it was a temple, and every book she carried was a prayer. At night, when the lights went out, she would whisper the alphabet to herself, as if reciting a spell to keep the world from collapsing. A, B, C, simple sounds that meant everything. The first sign that something had changed came quietly, like a chill in the air before a storm. It began with whispers, names being read at the roll call that no one had heard before, followed by numbers, and then the sound of trucks. In the camp, rumor traveled faster than truth, but this one carried weight. They said new lists had been drawn. The family camp was to be resettled. Dita heard it from Miriam, the teacher of the younger group. "They are saying our block is included," she murmured, eyes darting toward the window. "Maybe tomorrow, maybe next week. No one knows." Freddie Hirsch tried to calm them, but his voice lacked its usual steadiness. "There are always lists," he said. "They send some away and bring others. It means nothing until it happens, but everyone knew that in Auschwitz, nothing happened without meaning." That night, Dita sat on her bunk, the books spread before her like silent companions. The flickering light made the pages seem alive, trembling with the faint current of her breath. She tried to count them again, as she always did. 8 volumes, all accounted for. Yet now each one felt heavier, as though aware of the danger closing in. If the list was real, if they were to be resettled, there would be no time to hide them again. And if the books were found, they would not only disappear, they would condemn everyone who had touched them. She turned to the Book of Legends and ran her hand across its cover. The spine cracked softly, like an old door opening. She thought of the story inside about a man who carried light underground. Perhaps that was what she had been doing all along. Outside, footsteps passed, then faded. A siren wailed in the distance. The camp settled back into uneasy silence. At dawn, she found Hirsch by the fence near the wash area. His eyes were rimmed with exhaustion. He did not greet her, only handed her a folded scrap of paper. Inside were 2 names, hers and her mother's. "You are on it," he said quietly. She felt the words like a blow. When? Tomorrow. Maybe tonight. I do not know. She looked past him, toward the smokestacks that pierced the grey sky. She had seen what resettlement meant. Everyone had. Hirsch placed a hand on her shoulder. Listen to me. You must think carefully. If they take you, destroy the books first. Do not let them find them. She shook her head. I cannot burn them. Then hide them. Deeply. Somewhere they will not be seen. Promise me. She nodded, but the word promise felt fragile in her mouth. That evening, when the guards shouted for curfew, Dita slipped back into Barrack 31. The children were asleep, their small shapes curled under thin blankets. She moved quietly to the wall and began pulling up the loose boards near the corner. Beneath the floor, the earth was dry and cold. One by one, she placed the books inside. She paused over each, tracing the titles with her fingertips as though saying goodbye. The dictionary, the grammar, the manual, the legends. When she reached the last one, the small volume of the Old Testament, she hesitated. She could not bear to bury it. Instead, she tucked it beneath her coat, close to her skin. When the boards were back in place, she whispered, "If someone finds you, tell them we were here." The next day, the camp was alive with movement. Trucks idled, soldiers shouted names, families gathered their belongings in silence. Dita stood with her mother near the gate, waiting for their turn. The book pressed against her ribs like a heartbeat. Then suddenly, a confusion of orders. Another officer appeared, papers in hand, shouting new instructions. Some names were crossed off, others added. Dita's name was removed. Her mother's remained. They embraced briefly, the kind of embrace that contains everything one cannot say. Then her mother was gone, swallowed by the line moving toward the trucks. Dita stood frozen until the sound of engines drowned everything else. That night, she returned to Barrack 31. The children's block was silent now, half empty. She sat alone on the bench, the hidden books beneath her feet, her mother's name echoing in her mind. She opened the Old Testament and read by the faint light of the moon. The page she found was marked by a small tear. She did not know who had made it or when, but she decided it meant something. She whispered aloud, "And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." For the first time, she allowed herself to cry. The next morning, the camp was too quiet. The usual chorus of voices, shouts, and footsteps had faded to a low hum, as if the place itself were holding its breath. Dita walked toward Barrack 31 through a mist that clung to the ground like smoke. The door hung open. Inside, the air smelled of dust and cold wood. The benches were empty. The drawings that had once covered the walls were gone, torn away or trampled. A single paper bird lay near the stove, its wings bent. She picked it up and turned it in her fingers until the faintest trace of charcoal smudged her skin. Half of the children had been taken. The rest sat in silence, staring at her with hollow eyes that seemed far older than their years. One of the younger girls whispered, "Will they come back?" Dita had no answer. She wanted to say yes, but lies were harder to speak than truth. She placed her hand gently on the girl's shoulder instead. Freddie Hirsch came in quietly behind her. His face looked carved from stone. "They said it was resettlement again," he murmured. "We both know what that means." He paused, then added, "The books." "Safe," Dita replied. "They're under the floor." He nodded, though his expression didn't change. "Good. Then at least something of us remains." For a long while they stood in silence, listening to the faint sounds outside, the barking of dogs, the clank of buckets, the endless rhythm of the camp continuing as if nothing had happened. When the children began to fidget, Dita took a deep breath and forced her voice to sound steady. "All right," she said. "Today we will read from memory. Who remembers the story of the fisherman?" A boy raised his hand hesitantly. "He spoke to the stars," he whispered. "Yes," Dita said. "And what did the stars tell him?" The boy frowned in concentration. "They told him that as long as he looked up, he would never be lost." "Exactly," she said. "As long as he looked up." Her voice caught on the words, but she kept speaking. The children leaned closer, their small faces illuminated by a sliver of pale sunlight through the crack in the door. She told the story slowly, each sentence like a thread binding the room together. When she finished, no one clapped or smiled. They simply sat in silence, holding the moment like something too fragile to break. That night, she stayed in the barrack after curfew. Hirsch had gone to a meeting with the camp elders. She knew what it meant, though he had not said it. There were rumors that he had been offered a way out, perhaps through another transfer. She didn't ask. She only knew that he would not leave if it meant abandoning the children. She lit a small stub of candle and began to write again. The paper was coarse, the pencil nearly gone, but she managed a few lines. "The classroom is empty now, but the stories remain. The books sleep beneath us. If anyone finds this, know that we were here, that we taught, that we remembered. She folded the paper and slid it under the same floorboard that hid the books. Then she sat on the bench, the candle flickering beside her. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and soundless. Through the narrow window she could see the faint outline of the guard tower. Beyond it, the sky was wide and blank, without stars. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to imagine what the world might look like beyond the fenced streets, trees, the sound of footsteps on clean pavement, the simple freedom of choosing which way to walk. She wondered if she would ever see it again. But even as fear pressed against her, she felt something stronger. The stories she carried had not died with the children who were gone. They had simply been passed to her, like a torch. She whispered to the darkness, "I will keep telling them," and in that whisper, she found a strange kind of peace. The change came suddenly, like a curtain pulled across the stage of their fragile world. One morning, Freddie Hirsch did not appear at roll call. His absence felt like a gap in the air, a silence too large to ignore. Dita searched the campyard, the washrooms, the infirmary. No one would meet her eyes. By afternoon, the rumor had spread. He was gone. Some said he had been arrested for defying an order. Others whispered that he had been poisoned. A few claimed he had taken his own life rather than watch the children sent away again. No one knew the truth, and in Auschwitz, truth was often the first casualty. That evening, Dita sat alone in Barrack 31, the last traces of sunlight bleeding through the cracks in the wall. The benches were empty, the air still. She looked toward the place where Hirsch used to stand during lessons, his hands clasped behind his back, his calm voice cutting through the noise of the camp. She remembered his words, "The loudest courage is often quiet." It was strange how much noise silence could make. She went to the corner where the books were hidden and pulled up the loose board. The earth smelled damp, as if it had been crying too. She lifted one of the volumes, the Book of Legends, and opened it to a random page. The first line she saw read, "When the shepherd disappeared, the flock remembered his song." Her hands trembled, but she smiled. "He would have liked that," she whispered. The next day, the camp leadership changed. New guards arrived, colder and quicker to anger. The family camp was no longer treated as a model settlement. The illusion was no longer needed. Dita realized that everything Hirsch had built, the songs, the lessons, the fragile sense of dignity, was beginning to crumble, but she could not let it vanish completely. She took it upon herself to keep the routines alive. Every morning she opened the classroom, even when there were only a handful of children left. She taught letters, counted silently, repeated the old stories. When she finished, she would read a few lines from the Book of Legends under her breath. Sometimes she imagined Hirsch watching from the doorway, nodding in approval. The guards ignored her at first, thinking the education block no longer mattered. That indifference became her armor. Within those walls, she rebuilt what little of the old order she could. The lessons became shorter, quieter, but they still existed. The children still learned, and in their eyes, she saw a reflection of something Hirsch had once given them, the knowledge that even in captivity, their minds were free. At night, when the camp was dark and the wind moved through the fences like a voice, Dita lay awake, replaying every conversation she had ever had with him. His calm, his defiance, his belief that small acts mattered. She realized then that courage was not only found in those who led, but also in those who continued after the leaders were gone. She rose from her bunk and crossed to the hidden floorboards once more. She touched the wood gently and said aloud, "I will keep it going, Freddie, I promise." Outside, the searchlight swept across the barracks. The light flashed briefly through the window, illuminating her face and the faint blue numbers on her arm. For a second, she looked like both a child and something far older than her years. When the darkness returned, she sat down and began to whisper the lessons to herself. Letters, words, names, each one like a spark in the void. In that moment, she understood what Hirsch had meant. The quiet courage was not his alone. It had passed to her, and through her, to the children who still listened. By early 1945, the rhythm of the camp had changed again. The guards' orders came faster, sharper, but also carried an edge of uncertainty. The once precise routines had started to unravel. The roll calls grew shorter, sometimes skipped altogether. Dita noticed how often the officers argued among themselves, their radios crackling with static and tension. Something was happening beyond the wire. Rumors drifted through the camp like bits of ash on the wind. The Russians were advancing from the east. The Americans had crossed the Rhine. The Germans were retreating. To most prisoners, these were only words, fragile as the paper scraps they were written on. Hope had betrayed them too many times to be trusted now. But there was a change in the air, a restlessness, a sense that the machinery of the camp was beginning to falter. Trains no longer arrived as regularly. Smoke rose less often from the chimneys. Even the guards looked thinner, their boots unpolished, their eyes flickering toward the horizon. For Dita, each day had become both longer and shorter. She moved through her duties with a kind of quiet determination, opening the classroom each morning though few children remained. The benches were half empty now, the air heavy with sickness and hunger. She read softly, her voice sometimes breaking, but she refused to stop. The Book of Legends had grown fragile. Its cover was split, its spine loose. She had patched it with thread pulled from her uniform. When she turned the pages, the sound was like the whisper of wings. One afternoon, as she finished a lesson, a boy tugged at her sleeve. "Miss Dita," he said, "is the war almost over?" She looked at him, uncertain how to answer. The question was a wound. She wanted to say yes. She wanted to promise that within days they would be free, that the world outside still existed. But she had learned that false hope could be as cruel as despair. So she said gently, "Every war ends, even this one, but we must be here when it does." The boy nodded, his expression serious. "Then I will wait." That night, snow fell again, covering the camp in white. For a few hours it looked almost peaceful. Dita watched it from the window, the flakes glowing in the weak light of the search lamps. She imagined that each one carried a word, drifting down to rest on the ground where so many had been silenced. The next morning the peace shattered. Sirens blared, orders shouted in confusion. Trucks rumbled through the gates, soldiers rushing from one end of the camp to the other. Some said the prisoners were being moved west. Others whispered that the Germans were destroying evidence before the Allies arrived. Dita's first thought was for the books. She ran to Barrack 31, heart pounding. The door was half open, the room ransacked. Benches overturned, papers scattered. Someone had been searching. She went straight to the corner and lifted the loose board. The space beneath was untouched. The books were still there. Relief hit her so sharply she nearly fell to her knees. She touched each one, murmuring their titles like prayers. For a moment she considered taking them with her, but the camp was chaos, guards shouting, prisoners running, wagons loading. She realized that carrying them now would mean losing them forever. Instead, she reburied them carefully and whispered, "Stay here, wait for the light." That evening, she saw columns of prisoners being marched toward the gate. The guards shouted, forcing them into lines that disappeared into the snow. She knew some of them would never return. For the first time, she considered escape. The fences were still electrified, but the guards were distracted. Yet something in her refused to run. She could not abandon the books, the children who were gone, the promise she had made. She stayed. Night fell slowly, the air thick with smoke and wind. In the darkness, the camp seemed both dead and alive, a breathing monument to everything that had been lost and everything that still clung to existence. She lay awake, listening to the distant thunder of artillery. Each boom came a little closer. The end was coming. She could feel it. But she also knew that endings were dangerous things. They could rescue, or they could destroy. All she could do now was wait. And remember, it began with a sound low, distant, and unlike anything the camp had heard before. It wasn't the rhythm of marching boots or the harsh growl of German trucks. It was deeper, heavier, a continuous thunder that seemed to shake the air itself. At first, the prisoners thought it was another bombardment. They braced for the usual orders, the shouts, the panic. But the guards were not shouting this time. They were running. From her barrack window, Dita saw them packing hurriedly, throwing crates into vehicles, burning papers in metal drums. Smoke rose above the camp in thick grey columns. Then, as the engines roared, the gates opened, and the guards began to leave. Not in ranks, but in chaos, some fleeing on foot, others disappearing into the forest beyond the fence. By afternoon, the watchtowers were empty. The dogs were gone. The loudspeakers were silent. For hours, no one moved. The prisoners watched the gates as if afraid the silence itself were a trap. Then, somewhere near the women's section, someone whispered a single word, "Gone." The whisper grew, spreading like fire through the barracks. Gone. Gone. The guards are gone. Dita stepped outside, blinking against the pale sunlight. The air felt strange, too open, too wide. The snow had melted into mud, and her wooden clogs sank slightly with every step. She looked toward the main gate. It stood open, the barbed wire sagging. A small group of prisoners began walking forward. Others followed, hesitating at first, then faster, as if pulled by invisible gravity. Dita walked among them, still half disbelieving. Near the gate, She saw a shape in the distance, an armored vehicle, its turret covered in snow. The figure on top waved a flag she didn't recognize at first. Red, white, blue. Then came another sound. High and clear, the voice of a man shouting in Russian. The soldiers entered slowly, cautious, their faces covered with soot and exhaustion. They looked around the camp with expressions that shifted from confusion to horror. One of them dropped his rifle, covering his mouth. Another crossed himself. The prisoners stood frozen, unable to react. Then someone fell to their knees. Someone else began to cry. And just like that, the silence broke. Dita didn't cry. Not yet. She walked toward the soldiers, her body trembling with something beyond fear. When one of them reached her, he spoke softly, in words she barely understood, but she knew their meaning. "It's over." She nodded, but couldn't answer. The words felt too large to fit inside her chest. That night, for the first time in years, the camp lights did not turn on. The searchlights were dark. The air was quiet except for the sounds of sobbing, prayer, and disbelief. Dita sat near the steps of Barrack 31, watching the faint glow of fires still burning in the distance. She wanted to run into the forest, to keep walking until she found the edge of the world, but her legs refused to move. She felt both weightless and heavy, as if freedom itself were too vast to hold. At dawn, she went back inside the barrack. The floorboards still hid the books. She knelt, lifted the planks, and stared at them. They looked the same as they always had worn, quiet, waiting. She touched their covers one by one, whispering, "You made it." She gathered them in her arms and carried them outside. The snow had melted into a thin film of mud. The sun rose slowly, pale and gold, touching the towers and wires with light. For the first time, she saw the camp clearly not as a cage, but as a ruin of something that had failed to destroy her. She sat on the steps and opened the Book of Legends. The page she turned to read, "Those who remember are the builders of tomorrow." The words blurred as tears finally came. They were not tears of joy, nor of grief, but of release, the body remembering how to feel after forgetting for too long. Later that day, when Red Cross workers arrived, she handed them the books, one by one. "Keep them safe," she said. "They belong to everyone now." The man who took them hesitated. "You found these here?" She nodded. "No, they found me." That night, as she lay wrapped in a blanket for the first time in years, she closed her eyes and saw the children's faces, not as ghosts, but as light. She whispered to them, "We're free now. You can rest." And for the first time, sleep came without fear. Spring arrived slowly that year, hesitant and pale, as if unsure it was welcome after so much winter. The war was ending, or so they said, but for those who had survived, time did not move forward, it wandered. Dita was among the few transported west after liberation for recovery. Her body healed faster than her mind. She ate because the nurses told her to, slept because exhaustion demanded it, and woke each morning unsure if she was truly alive or simply dreaming of the world she had lost. When she could finally walk without trembling, she began to ask questions about her parents, about Prague, about the others from the family camp. The answers were always the same: records missing, transports destroyed, no lists survived. Silence had swallowed too many names. By the end of that summer, she decided to return. Not to live there, but to see it, to face it. She needed to know that the place where her childhood ended still existed, that it hadn't dissolved into legend like the stories she had guarded. The train to Poland was almost empty. The countryside rolled past the window, green fields, quiet villages, children playing near rivers. It looked like another planet. When the train stopped near Auschwitz, the air was heavy with the smell of rain and rust. She walked alone down the dirt road leading to the old gate. The iron letters were still there. Arbeit macht frei. Rust streaked the metal, but the words remained. The silence pressed down like a weight. The camp was no longer a place of terror, but it was not at peace either. It was hollow, stripped of movement, echoing with ghosts. The barracks stood in rows, their doors hanging open. Grass grew where bodies once fell. She found Barrack 31 easily. It was smaller than she remembered. The roof partly collapsed, the windows gone. She stepped inside. The air smelled of damp wood and dust. The benches were gone, but the floorboards were still there. Her hands shook as she lifted the same plank she had touched so many times. The earth beneath was dry. She reached down and found nothing but soil and a few fragments of paper. They disintegrated when she tried to lift them. She sat back on her heels, feeling an ache she hadn't known she still carried. The books were gone. Maybe someone had found them during the months after liberation. Maybe they had been taken, lost, burned. It didn't matter. What mattered was that they had lived long enough to be remembered. She looked around the empty room and saw it as it had been the children, the songs, the lessons whispered between danger and hope. She could almost hear their voices again, rising softly in the half-light. In the corner, she noticed something half buried in dust, a small wooden stool. One leg was cracked, the top stained with ink. She brushed it clean and found faint scratches carved into the surface. Initials, letters, her own handwriting, childish and careful. D.K. She laughed, then cried, then laughed again, the sound echoing through the hollow room. She sat on the stool and began to speak aloud, not to anyone in particular, but to the walls, the ghosts, and the silence that still listened. "We did not vanish," she said. "You tried to erase us, but we learned, we read, we remembered." Outside, the wind moved through the grass, soft and constant. The barrack door creaked on its hinges. She closed her eyes and imagined that it was the sound of a page turning. When she finally stood to leave, she took nothing with her. The stool, the dust, the memories, they belonged to the place. But as she walked back through the gate, she felt lighter. The burden she had carried for years had begun to shift, no longer crushing, but part of her shape, like a scar that no longer hurt. At the edge of the road, she turned one last time. The towers stood against the sky, rusted but still upright. She whispered, "Goodbye, teacher. Goodbye, children." Then she began walking toward the station, her footsteps slow but steady. Behind her, the wind blew across the empty field, carrying faint echoes of laughter and turning pages that no one would ever hear again. Years passed. The world rebuilt itself with the same clumsy persistence as a wounded body learning to walk again. Cities rose from rubble, borders shifted. New governments promised that such darkness would never return. But memory is slower than history. For those who survived, the war never truly ended, it only changed shape. Dita eventually found her way to Israel. She married a man who had also survived, a quiet pilot with kind eyes and an unshakable patience. They had children, then grandchildren. She became a teacher, not because she planned to, but because one morning, standing in a classroom, she realized she had never really stopped teaching. Her students never knew, at first, what she had endured. She taught them geography and literature, told them about rivers and mountains, about faraway cities and the sound of different languages. Sometimes she paused during lessons, remembering the classroom in Barrack 31, the children tracing letters in the dirt, the whispers of stories, the feel of a hidden book against her skin. When her students grew restless, she smiled and said, "Knowledge is the only thing that cannot be taken from you." The same words her father had spoken long ago in Prague. Decades later, a historian came to interview her for a documentary about the camp. By then, her hair was silver and her hands were thin and lined, but her eyes were steady. The interviewer asked if it was true that she had kept books hidden in Auschwitz. "Yes," she said simply. 8 of them. He asked why she had risked her life for books. She thought for a moment before answering, "Because they reminded us that we were still human. In a place built to destroy everything human, that was reason enough." After the documentary aired, letters began to arrive, students, teachers, strangers from all over the world. Some sent photographs of old libraries rebuilt after the war. Others wrote that they had become teachers because of her story. Dita answered as many as she could, signing each with the same words, "Never forget that knowledge is freedom." In her later years, she returned once more to Poland, this time as a guest of honor. A museum had been built near the old camp, preserving what remained of the past. Inside one of the glass displays were several worn books rescued years after the liberation, found near the site of Barrack 31. No one could say for certain if they were hers, but when she looked at them, she smiled. "They don't need to be mine," she told the curator. "They belong to everyone who still believes in light." On the day of the ceremony, school children read aloud from one of the books, their voices clear and steady. Dita closed her eyes and listened. The words filled the hall, rising and falling like a tide. For a moment, she could hear them, all the children of the camp, their laughter, their songs, their fragile voices defying silence. When the reading ended, she stood and said quietly, "Books are not made only of paper. They are made of people, of those who write, those who read, and those who remember." In her final years, she often sat by the window of her small apartment, surrounded by books. Some were new, some decades old. The sunlight fell across the pages, and when she closed her eyes, she could almost feel the warmth of that February morning long ago, the weight of the first hidden book pressed against her heart. She knew then that she had kept her promise. The books had lived, she had lived, and the light they carried had never gone out.